We can choose, if we wish, to be on the side of humanity and do the hard work necessary, or we can shamefully decide that our fellow men, women, and children just aren't worth the effort.
I think it was quite clear from even our first speaker, Eric Garcetti, when he talked about the causes of homelessness. He went through a litany of failed policies, from mental health to veterans, to housing policy, to reduction in poverty programs, to incarceration policies, and so on. It was quite clear that public policy and policies are central to this whole issue. It's also clear that from his and others' talks that even though we're housing a lot of people, the inflow of new people who are homeless continues to exceed the number of people that we are able to house. And that issue also is extremely important from a policy point of view. And as one of our speakers said, the key to that is that we have over 500,000 shortage of housing units, and we need policies that are going to facilitate the development of much more affordable housing.
At risk of wasting just a moment of my time, can I ask you all to stand up? And as the Honorable Mark Ridley Thomas started our day, can we say, everybody in? Everybody in. Everybody in. Everybody in. You can be seated if you want, or stand while I talk, but I did want to, in many ways, use that as the reference point for the challenge that was set before me as an academic, as a researcher, which what does it mean to be everyone in, everybody in, when it comes to solving one of our grand challenges of homelessness? And through a set of conversations, and Elise brought it up this morning with the United Way and with the Hilton Foundation and with many in the research community, we're going to soon launch officially something called the Homelessness Policy Research Institute. And so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it. I realize, having sat in the back, that those of you in the back can't read any of the slides unless your eyes are much, much better than mine. But the idea in the Homelessness Policy Research Institute, I think I can read this one better than the one over here, is that it's going to bring together 30 policymakers. It's going to bring together local and national researchers who are looking at homelessness questions to design and coordinate timely, relevant, and actionable research to end homelessness in LA County. And it's that actionable part that really catalyzes our group. When we think about what we're trying to do, we have kind of 4 objectives of the Institute when it launches soon: to foster collaboration and coordination among researchers, to conduct rapid response research and data analyses, and to share with policymakers and community partners that can inform their on-the-ground work, to share current and upcoming research with policymakers and community partners to also inform the on-the-ground work, and to be a place to provide RFP services for the funding community, and that means county, city, foundations, etc., to come to a place where we can be a kind of a linchpin, a coordinator for those who want to get research funded on prevention, to stop the inflow, to figure out how to reduce the inflows, and also on interventions to find the most effective tools that are out there to catalyze change and to move to end homelessness. So one of my colleagues at the California Community Foundation, Ann Sewell, started her day with a little grumble. She said, innovation, innovation, innovation. We don't need innovation. We just need to do what we know works. And in many ways, she's absolutely right. If we just did what we know works, we would get so far to ending homelessness. Now, me being the director of the Center for Social Innovation, you might think, well, you're going to bristle at such a fact. But in fact, I embrace it. Because where innovation is needed is in certain spaces, but in reality, we shouldn't think we don't know answers. We should not think we don't know what to do. And that's exactly the role of this Homelessness Policy Research Institute, is to take what we know and bring it to LA, no matter where it comes from. Now it functions, and this has been a planning year for us to kind of figure out how could this even work and how does it fit. So I'm going to put up a really exciting chart here, which you can't fully read, but it does illustrate kind of how we're trying to integrate with the community to actually fit in this nexus of funders who want to provide resources, so from Measure H to Measure HHH to, philanthropy, to policymakers who have to make decisions on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis, to researchers who are used to a much slower time process, to do very careful research, to then tell you what you should have done 5 years ago, 5 years too late sometimes. So how do you kind of change that culture? So the organizational structure as it currently sits is that there's United Way, the Price Center for Social Innovation, that's convening a research committee. That research committee includes many of the faculty who are in this room here today, and my colleague Susanna's on the steering committee, which is kind of helps guiding us as we're gone through the planning process. It includes faculty from UCLA, faculty from Rand. This itself is an achievement to bring together faculty from multiple institutions. It brings together people who are in the research community more broadly, people from the Urban Institute and Apt Associates and Economic Roundtable and other groups have been working in this space for a while. And so what we're trying to do then is interact with the Home for Good policy table, which was mentioned earlier today. Policymakers, and you saw many of them speak actually, who sit at that table. They're like, this is the problem we're facing today. And we've created kind of what we call temporarily a conference committee to kind of figure out what is the research agenda that researchers know from a research standpoint. We know these are questions that haven't been answered. And from the policy table, they're saying, I need to know an answer today on how to reduce visible homelessness or street homelessness in this particular place. And so, it has been becoming the case now as people are starting to learn about this planning phase that we get calls on at least a weekly basis from either LASA, the city last week called and said, can you give us an answer on what 2 interventions work best for veterans and youth homelessness by Friday, right? So, those kinds of things are not what we're used to in the academy, but what we're really excited is to engage this research community, the policy community, the resources that are out there to actually take those next steps to end homelessness in LA County. Thank you very much.
Where are the people with lived experience on your piano?
Where are the people with lived experience? That is a great question, and I don't have an answer for you today other than we don't have them in this particular structure, so we're getting that information now through a conduit, which is through the Home for Good and United Way policy table in those communities. But let's talk about that.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chelsea Byers. It's super exciting to be here. I've spent a lot of time in this room, part of the public policy schools programming, and I didn't ever imagine myself on this stage as part of the programming, so this is very cool. I grew up in Mesa, Arizona. My parents owned a small custom floor design installation business, and I spent a lot of my Saturday mornings waking up very, very early to spend time with my dad, going and visiting job sites. We'd get an Egg McMuffin, or if I was super lucky, a chicken fried steak with lots of gravy, and go out to the job sites where I got to see people's dream homes by the dozens and dozens and even hundreds. And I spent a lot of my time there. I didn't imagine that when I was a junior in high school in 2006 that I would lose my own home where dreams were built for myself. Our family lost our home in the financial crisis, and that upended and changed my world forever. I was already a very socially oriented individual, but that, of course, catalyzed a new light in me. I began fighting for my future and for the future of so many others as a political organizer. And for folks who don't know, an organizer is essentially someone who listens deeply and responsibly, reflects, and moves people to action based on what that understanding is. So this work has manifested itself in many ways for myself, most currently as the Director of Local Organizing for Abundant Housing Los Angeles and as a field organizer for Everyone In. I'll talk mostly about Abundant Housing Los Angeles because Elise already spent some time talking about Everyone In, and thanks for the ups on it. Abundant Housing is an all-volunteer advocacy organization advocating for housing of all types, supportive housing, affordable housing, and market rate housing, because we're well aware that we're in a housing crisis as well as a homelessness crisis, and we have to do a lot very comprehensively to lift those numbers of houses. So we do that by advocating for new projects, as well as policies that would increase the capacity for new housing. We do that by uplifting and empowering the silent majority, right? The 70% that Elise mentioned earlier of residents who in fact do support housing, particularly housing for the most impacted communities. And we've done this really effectively. We have a membership list of about 1,600 people who take sometimes daily, but mostly weekly action by writing emails, signing petition letters, and most importantly, showing up. Showing up where it counts the most, in neighborhood council meetings, plum hearings, city council, the list goes on. This humanitarian crisis, like many others, is actually a crisis of political disenfranchisement, right? We know voter turnout around these issues has been really incredibly moving and changing when we look at Measure H and HHH. But overall, this is still a matter of political enfranchisement. Who is representing the community and whose voices they're hearing the most? So this NIMBY voice, as it's known, has a really strong grip on our political channels, and Abundant Housing has been engaging people to take action by voicing and telling stories like mine. That's why I began with my story, because I think every single person in this room has a story, or a story that you know of other people, or you're connected to people with stories. And it's just as easy as going up and sharing it, even if your voice shakes, and getting it out there and heard. So how many people in this room have actually gone to their neighborhood councils? Okay, I wanted to see every single hand up, because this is literally part of the problem. If we're not using those very simple basic channels every single day to make a difference, then we're missing one of the biggest opportunities we have to make an issue or an impact, right? Yeah, thank you. I mean, we can come up with all the solutions we want, all the amazing innovations, but if they're not being heard, and more importantly, if our political representation doesn't reflect what these voices are, we're screwed. We're totally screwed. So this is really a matter of that, just engaging our elected officials. Starting at the neighborhood council level for us is where we are. We're doing a local leaders program, 98 neighborhood council districts. We're gonna get people in every single one turning out regularly. And otherwise, you know, the future of the Los Angeles housing crisis will continue to be co-opted by a small subset of voices that do not represent every single one of us. So the good news is, because as we've proved today, housing is a totally intersectional issue. There are so many different roads that lead us to housing. My other hat is actually as the national coordinator for the campaign to abolish statutes of limitations on rape and sexual assault. And I came to housing because I recognized that women were deeply, deeply impacted by this, that the majority of women in the streets are impacted by sexual violence. And how do we talk about housing if we don't know the trauma that people are facing? So here we are as a broad intersectional movement, gearing up for greater political enfranchisement for the future, which means really great things, I think, for Los Angeles to come. So let's keep at it.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased and very grateful to have this opportunity to talk with you. And I have been asked very specifically to talk about social inclusion and social exclusion as they relate to ending homelessness in Los Angeles, and particularly as they relate to a separation between people who are currently experiencing homelessness and people who have homes. So social inclusion, social exclusion, these are not issues that we talk about very frequently when we raise the issues of addressing homelessness. And they're challenging issues to discuss, but they are important, and the implications go beyond homelessness in terms of this social inclusion and social exclusion. But I thought I would start by giving you a definition of social inclusion. And this comes from the United Nations. And please remember that the United States is a member of the United Nations. Social inclusion. Social inclusion is a process aimed at creating conditions that enable the full and active participation of every member of the society in all aspects of life, including civic participation, social participation, participation in economic activities. And in other words, it's a process of acting on the idea that every one of us has an active and meaningful role to play in a shared society. And the members about 20 years ago made a commitment to promote inclusive societies that are stable, safe, tolerant, that respect diversity, that respect and promote equality. Now let's bring this back to homelessness. And well, this certainly speaks to the importance of housing. Housing is key to promoting social inclusion. It's what is safe, it's stable, it's just, and having a home helps enable one to better participate in society. That's not the only story. So let's talk also about social exclusion. This refers to people being marginalized, disregarded, excluded from full participation in society, excluded from their communities. It's discrimination. And this is a process, obviously, that works in opposition of creating a more inclusive society. And these instances of social exclusion can be driven by certainly well-entrenched structural factors, systemic factors, but also by stereotypes, the beliefs that we have, the biases that we have about people who are currently experiencing homelessness, whether they are conscious biases or unconscious implicit biases. And these stereotypes, this is what we might see expressed in the NIMBYism, in the community resistance. And so this speaks to the separation between homeless persons and other persons, housed persons. And we cannot talk about social exclusion with respect to housing without also talking about people being marginalized and discriminated against because of the color of their skin. And as we all know, Black persons make up only 9% of Los Angeles County's total population, but 40% of people experiencing homelessness across Los Angeles County are Black. So this disproportionality is certainly part of a legacy of years and years of social exclusion that has to be addressed as we move forward in addressing homelessness. So a challenge, I see I have just a few minutes left, as we move forward in our efforts to end homelessness, one significant ongoing challenge related to social exclusion is combating the stereotypes, the unfortunate false beliefs about persons who are experiencing homelessness, both on a conscious level and unconscious level, the implicit biases that we all carry because we live in this society. And I want to just mention some solutions. That's part of the request to discuss social inclusion, is to talk about some inclusions, to promote it. And there are excellent efforts already underway. They are supported well by the United Way. The United Way's Everyone In campaign is an example of what we need to do to promote social understanding, to promote social inclusion among persons experiencing homelessness. And social media is key. As much information, education, public service announcements as we can put out, the better. But it also means speaking out as citizens, and that's already been discussed. It also means creating safe platforms where people with lived experiences can speak. And I also want to note that interventions and solutions must also be driven by the people in the communities with the lived experiences. It can't simply be imposed from a top-down hierarchy. I'm doing my best, and I strongly believe that that is the way to create the most efficacious means of addressing this issue. And I also want to put in a word for professional diversity and inclusion training from the top levels of our institutions to the on-the-ground persons. Because again, I believe we all harbor implicit biases by virtue of having grown up in a society in which racism still exists and discrimination of various kinds exists among impoverished persons as well. I want to make one more point, thinking very broadly, that I would like to think about a next step to consider, that we might consider jointly, might be an expanded multi-level interagency approach to address the intersection of homelessness, poverty, and racism, persistent racism. And I will leave you with that because my time is literally up. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you first to USC for putting its energy and resources and brain power behind what is what is the number one issue that's concerning Angelenos. And I've been in public office now for about 12 years as a council member. Prior to that, I was a school board member for 4 years. I've seen a lot of polls throughout the years. And typically, we've seen the number one concern or the number one issue on voters' minds is education or crime or transportation. Those are usually the top, and then they interchange throughout the years. But in the last couple of years, homelessness has shot up to number one, and it's been consistent there in all the polls I've seen. And certainly, we've seen that in that the reasons for that, because prior to the last few years, homelessness was confined to concentrated areas in the city, such as Hollywood, Venice, downtown, and Skid Row. But now we see the encampments everywhere, we feel it everywhere, and certainly homelessness has increased from last year to this year, 20% jump in just 1 year, so we feel it. And it's not unique to Los Angeles. I mean, this is something that you probably heard earlier today. It's happening throughout the world, the country. What's unique about this to Los Angeles is that we do have the largest concentration of homeless who are living in our streets. In Skid Row, we have about 4,000 to 5,000 individuals who are considered homelessness, but about 2,000 of those are living on the streets each night. But I would say what has changed in the last 2-3 years from a city council perspective is that we are in a very different place. You see, prior to the last couple of years, the way we dealt with homelessness as a policy issue, we were simply reacting to the latest lawsuit, reacting to the latest writ that the court told us what we can and cannot do. We didn't have a proactive policy. Also, I've been on the council 12 years. What we saw is that the council member who represented Skid Row was responsible for homeless policy. We looked to that one person, but now everybody is hands on deck, and we've done a whole lot more. We have attempted to set the governance to address homelessness. A couple of years ago, I went up to Councilmember Weston and I said, hey, we need a homelessness committee to deal with homelessness each and every day, just like we do with transportation, public safety, and every other city policy. We set up that committee. Our objective when we set up that committee was then to create a strategic homeless plan that we've never had. We never knew what we were going to do proactively. We coordinated with the county so that they looked at their respective responsibilities and the city would look at its respective responsibilities. From that strategic plan, we wanted to do or approach the housing first policy or approach to addressing homelessness and provide more permanent supportive housing because we thought that that was the most effective way to address homelessness. So we passed or put out to the voters to support Measure HHH, and thankfully they supported it, $1.2 billion to create 10,000 units of permanent supportive housing over the next 10 years. After we passed that, and we saw that there was a long-term plan in place to address homelessness, we felt more comfortable moving forward with some more immediate things to do. And what is that? We need to find immediate sheltering, emergency sheltering, crisis sheltering, and something, as we've heard before, we're so short on those beds. So we went out and scoured, and we are scouring, we continue to scour, find public-owned facilities and parking lots so that we are able to put that emergency housing up right away. One of the first ones was at Pueblo, where the mayor and I worked to establish an emergency crisis shelter that would go up this summer. We will house 60 to 70 individuals on a 3-month basis for 3 years. They would be there for about 6 months, but it's quite expensive. It costs about $1.2 million for setup, about $1.3 million to operate per year. But my answer to that, when people say it is expensive, I tell them, well, you know what? It's a lot more expensive to leave these individuals in the street with medical attention, police services, fire services, and everything else that goes with it. So I think the city is in a place now that's in a much better place. We have the resources with not only HHH, the county has H, we also have public opinion that is supporting us. I was yet 2 days ago at LMU where they released some results from some of their polling that they do on various issues throughout the city, and this is what it found. 72% of Angelenos would support the building of permanent supportive housing within 10 blocks or about 1 mile of their home. That is quite surprising because we do talk a lot about NIMBYism, but perhaps 1 or 2 projects get a lot of attention as being NIMBY projects, right? So there's a lot of support for it. 68% of Angelenos would support building permanent supportive housing within 5 blocks or about a half mile of their home. And they also found that 78% of Angelenos would be willing to pay more in taxes or fees to help decrease homelessness. That's very surprising. They just recently passed a quarter-cent sales tax for the county. which will provide $350 million more dollars a year for social services and health services for homeless. And they're willing to do it again. They passed the HHH, and they're willing to do it again. So I think we are in a very good position where finally there's a lot of attention. The governance is being created. The county and the city is coordinating unlike any other time before. The resources are there. The public opinion is there to support it. And when I was in public policy school, I was always told there's windows of opportunity when you could pass good, creative, innovative policy, and I think this is the time. But we need more partners. Here locally, we got the momentum going, which is good, but we need the support of the state in some very critical places. One is support with mental health. Our mental health system is broken. We have to change definitions of when we could care for others and care the definition of when we could actually not only hold them for 78 hours and we have to let them go because of other court decisions. Secondly, we need more psychiatric beds. We simply do not have enough. And when some of you go to downtown and see it, my time is up, I'll finish with this, see it, a lot of people, a lot of individuals with mental health issues go downtown, try to get the services they need, but we are not equipped to give them the services. They end up wandering around the streets of downtown, many times exhibiting erratic behavior. Untreated mentally health challenged people are not mentally health people are not dangerous, but untreated they are, and that is one place we need to fix our mental health system and support more people for affordable housing, because that leads to homelessness if we don't address homelessness. Thank you so much. Address affordable housing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, panelists. We now have 10 minutes, and I have been given 14 questions. All of which are pretty interesting. So I'm going to ask you to be sort of targeted in your response. One of those questions has to do with whether when supportive housing is built, how can we assure that that is not going to produce the kind of institutionalized public housing that we saw from the federal government in the past that led to poverty and concentration of poverty over time?
Well, I think one key distinction is you just used the word supportive with housing. In the past, it was housing and then exclusion of services, public goods, and all those kinds of things that would have been appropriate there. One of the things that you might notice is that we actually applaud density if you are at least middle class, maybe not too much lower, but certainly upper class. Like, great, let's get it all dense and look and have that urban life and so forth. But then we wonder why it doesn't work for those who are poor. Well, that's because we don't have, it's not supportive. So I think the commitment to supportive housing can cause us to diverge from the vision of the tower in Chicago and those kinds of things.
Anybody else? Yes.
I think there's general consensus as we're building housing in Los Angeles that we don't want to go back to the policies of the 50s and 60s where we segregated poor people, and we want to get away from that. So whether it's permanent supportive housing, affordable housing, I don't think there's anyone thinking that we should do that. But with respect to permanent supportive housing, we want to, and the types of projects we see coming in the pipeline and being created, when you look at these, they look like any other apartment complex, and that's what we want to do. We want that permanent supportive housing unit to fit into the neighborhood, not make it stand out, and not make it any other different as if a new apartment complex, whether it's market rate or affordable housing or whatever it may be, it just fits in the neighborhood. And that's what we're seeing. Well-designed complexes that are not, don't stand out for any reason. And so that's the direction we want to go, and that's the type of product we've been seeing.
Okay, very good. Second question. What are the restrictions or requirements on developers to develop affordable housing that might prevent them from doing it? Is that one of the reasons we're not getting the market response? In other words, why isn't more affordable housing being provided by the private market, by all the developers? We're at the center of real estate here in Southern California. What is it that's preventing developers from developing more affordable housing?
The subsidy you need to build affordable housing has dried up. The Affordable Housing Trust Fund that the city has used to have hundreds of millions of dollars in it. Now it's dried up 2-3 years ago. The good news is we passed a linkage fee. It's a developer fee that will provide about $100 million more a year to put into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is good news. But the state needs to step up and the federal government needs to step up. We receive here locally a lot less money than we did 5-10 years ago to provide, because the developers match money from different places, different pots of money, and for the subsidy they need. So that's one issue, the source of subsidy they need to build it. The second issue is it's very expensive to build affordable housing. $400,000 to $500,000 dollars it costs to build one affordable housing unit. So when the developer comes in, they're debating with the city to say, hey, let me build market rate. It's a lot more profitable for us. So
Is that $400,000 to $500,000 cost that high in part because of certain types of regulations or requirements that make it that expensive?
It's our city codes that we have certain types of amenities and things, other requirements that we need. And that's why we passed something called the Permanent Supportive Housing Ordinance recently, just last week, which is not only going to make it quicker to build permanent supportive housing, it doesn't have to go through all this red tape, but secondly, it's going to have less parking requirements, less setback requirements. So we're trying to find ways that make it cheaper and not as expensive, but we have a long way to go to create that. So anybody here who wants to help us with that, how do we help the developers create less expensive cost per unit of permanent supportive housing? And it's a bit more expensive as well because you have to have community rooms and other service rooms for the people who are living there. That's why you call it permanent supportive housing. The services have to be on location. So it does get a little bit more expensive as a whole as well because we want these facilities and rooms to be there so that the individuals get services on site.
Gary?
So just, I'm glad the councilmember just emphasized time is money. So for developers, the time that can be almost as important as the actual physical development cost. And while there's a lot of people working on innovations and construction costs and so forth, I think the other thing we have to think about is that we're not always needing to talk about new affordable housing. What we've seen nationwide is that for every one new affordable unit that's built, 3 are lost. Mm-hmm. Right? So what we have to think about is new strategies to preserve the existing affordable, either has had contracts and these kinds of things, or just the naturally occurring. How do we figure out ways to catalyze private capital to actually fund rehab and keep those units in the affordable stock for longer? Because what happened in Los Angeles is that for 20 years we built very little kind of just what I would call market rate housing, not luxury housing and so forth. The normal process had been for that market rate housing to kind of filter down over 20 years. We're now in that donut hole where that didn't filter down. And so we have to think about the preservation. And I know the city has some pilot programs and some money to kind of look at that, but there needs to be much more attention and resources placed in that direction.
One final point on that. Affordable housing, when they initially built it, they have covenants that require them to keep it affordable for a certain number of years. We have so many expiring this year and ongoing, and the city has no revenue to go to the owner and say, hey, let's continue your covenants. And you're right, we're losing those. We had been focused so much on creation of new that we're losing those, and we have no revenue to help keep those affordable.
This is a related question, and it has to do with gentrification. And you can see if you go around LA, it's happening in many neighborhoods. And people who might have been able to afford housing now seeing their rents jump high because of gentrification. Are there policies related to gentrification and the displacement of people that we need to focus on, as this could be one of the sources of inflow into the homeless population?
Yeah, one of the policy ideas that came out of abundant housing when we were looking at the SB 827 when that was coming up, and there's a lot of need to address the lack of affordability components with regards to 827, which was the density or the upzoning bill for the whole state of California, was right of return. So what kind of policy do we allow if people are getting pushed out of their houses for new development to come in? Are they able to come back to that development at the same rate that they were there? Just something that simple could happen on a statewide level.
Does that happen?
I don't know that it happens now. It was an idea that came out of those conversations.
Okay.
Boyle Heights, which has been in the news quite a bit about gentrification, I read the newspaper and I disagree a lot with what I see there, because I don't think Boyle Heights will be gentrified to the extent that people are talking about it. It's a low-income area. I live in Boyle Heights. I grew up there. And the reason being is that 75% of the people who live in Boyle Heights are renters. Of those, 90% are protected by rent control. So they're not going to voluntarily move out because they're keeping the rent very cheap. And unless the government does something to, expel them or displace them, they're going to be there. It's a permanent renter-based tenants that would now move out, and you won't see this mass displacement if that's how you define gentrification. But what we have to do, though, is to protect those tenants. They have to know their rights, because you do see a lot of harassment of tenants who the landlord would love to see them leave because they no longer have to pay the rent control. So they've tried to find different ways, and many of these individuals don't know their rights. So we started a campaign in Boyle Heights where we walked 15,000 units of rent control units and informed them about their rights and got them in contact with attorneys should they need assistance. And that's the type of protections we should do to protect low-income tenants from gentrification pressures.
This was mentioned by one of the speakers. Is rent control and the expansion of it a policy that the city or county should pursue as part of the solution to this?
Well, what's really interesting about any one solution that's discussed is that, when I put my economist training hat on, I can always think of the good and the bad from that one solution, right? So you mentioned linkage fee, and I can talk about rent control. Like, these are the things in my very first day of economics. They say, if you have rent control, it will reduce the supply of housing in the long run. And I think that is true. If only policy was rent control, then it's going to reduce the supply of housing in the long run. But if you do a portfolio of policies where it has maybe a little linkage fee, a little rent control, a little bit of speed up the development process, and think holistically about a portfolio of interventions, you actually can see the kind of outcomes that we hope for. So the problem is we ask the question about this one thing.
Yeah.
And if we do that, you're going to get a lot of excitement and also enthusiasm in the positive and negative directions around that one thing. But instead of thinking about it as part of a system of public policies, then it can be part of that.
Okay, yes. These, when you look at the $355 million a year plus the $1.2 billion bond, that's a lot of money. It's well over $1 billion just for one component of that. One of the questions is, what neutral, transparent oversight group should there be established to monitor how these and track how these funds are spent? Anybody concerned about that? Suzanne?
I would certainly go back to the point I made about the importance of involvement at multiple levels, and for this issue as well, that there should be on-the-ground community representation as part of that quality control or monitoring board. I think that would just be an ethical choice and would just enrich the process of quality assurance and performance monitoring.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
Well, HHH has a Citizens Oversight Committee that is appointed. A lot of public members, community members oversee the funding of that. I'm not quite sure if H has the same, but I suspect they do.
Okay. These two questions are related. This question is, Latino homelessness has increased. We have 1 minute, so you're going to have to give a quick answer to this. Latino homelessness has increased by 63%. How will the unhoused Latino population be included in the policy research that is proposed? And then related to that is, how will we provide supportive permanent housing for undocumented Angelenos?
And are you looking at me because I'm Latino, the only Latino up here? Well, first of all, I would suspect that the reason you see a larger number of Latinos who are becoming or experiencing homelessness is because the largest demographic of people who are now becoming homeless are those who simply cannot afford to pay the rent. I mean, they're at the brink of paying check to check and they can't afford the rent, and that's a new demographic. And I would think that Latinos are a huge part of that, and that's why you see a larger proportion of Latinos now becoming homelessness. And we would address Latinos in any other way we would address as we move forward in addressing homelessness, I think.
Because one of these issues, this was alluded to as well, seems to be the kind of credit system that we have and the payment system, and the kind of rules and regulations around that. Time is up.
For undocumented individuals, by the way, not all Latinos are undocumented. I was once, by the way. Anyway, so can you, that's a whole other topic. You guys want to go into immigration policy? We never check for a person's documentation status. And that's consistent with any other policy we have in the city, which was Special Order 40, where we never ask any victim of crime or witness of crime, whether they're documented or not. We want individuals to come out of the shadows, participate, and be part of society. They're much more productive that way. Immigration is a federal issue. If they're here, they're a live human being. We do not ask them whether they're documented or not for any of our services.
All right. So thank you all for those insightful comments.